All right, well, welcome back, everyone. We just want to go ahead and take a second. We realized we didn't do this morning. For those of you who are certified arborists, we wanted to make certain that we let you know that today's session qualifies for ISA credits as well. And we have them right here. We'd show them to you, but I'm pretty sure if I held them up to the camera, it'd be tough to make them out. This morning's session qualifies for a quarter credit of BCMA science, a half credit practice, quarter credit management, 1 credit climber specialist, 1 credit for certified arborist, 1 credit utility specialist, 1 credit municipal specialist, and 1 credit for aerial lift. And that is for the talk you're about to hear with Dr. Fair. Now, this first session this morning also counted, and the credits it counted for were, again, half credit BCMA science, half a credit for management, and a full credit for climber specialist, certified arborist, utility specialist, municipal specialist, and aerial lift. So I know we just read these off pretty quickly, but if you need to hear any of that again, just let us know in the chat and we'll let you know what ISA credits are covered again. And with that, I'm handing it off to our ever fearless host to welcome our second speaker.
Thanks, Richie. Welcome back, everyone. Our second presenter is Dr. Barbara Fair, who is an associate professor in the Department of Horticultural Science and landscape specialist for North Carolina. She provides expertise to extension faculty in the green industry, focusing extensively on issues of landscape sustainability and arboriculture. In addition, Barbara teaches landscape ecosystem management and green infrastructure, the functional use of plants in urban landscapes at North Carolina State in the 4-year program. She is a certified arborist with an extensive arboriculture and urban forestry background. Barbara earned her bachelor's and master's from Penn State University and her PhD from Ohio State. Welcome, Barbara. The floor is yours. Barbara, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sure can.
Okay, great. So good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me here today. I'm going to get right into it. We're going to talk today, of course, about managing for sustainable landscapes, how to stop and prevent pests and other stressors. So it's kind of great, the conversation at the end of the last presenter's talk, where you kind of mentioned how do we deal with stress in our landscapes and what precludes insect and disease issues. And usually it is often human caused, and certainly plants under stressful conditions where we're growing them in environments that really aren't where they really want to grow. So we'll talk about what kind of makes up sustainable landscapes, and sort of a lot of it is background to what prevents insects and diseases. I'm not going to talk a lot about chemistry and things like that, because really the whole idea is to plan for that future landscape. So thinking about how do we get plants in our landscapes. These are honey locust in Ohio. This was a study that had been done a number of years ago. These were trees that they had planted, and 40 years later went back to look at those same trees and found in some cases they were still there, in other cases not so much, where maybe there was a mall or some other sort of situation there. But a lot of the trees actually did quite well. And I want to point out here, something I will mention a little bit later, is we use a lot of the same plants in the landscape. And that can tend to be a problem with what happens with insect and disease issues. So
Hey,
what
Dr.
defines,
Fair?
yes.
We're not seeing your slide set. Can you go ahead and share that again with us real quick?
I will. We good now?
We sure are. Thanks a lot.
Okay, cool. I'll just go back and show this really cool picture. So these were honey locust trees, as I was kind of explaining. So you see this picture is from Chicago, and these were bald cypress. This is the middle of summer, so all of them should have leaves on. They spent a lot of money actually trying to prep this site, putting in grates and making cutouts, but they failed to do one really important thing, and that was to deal with the soil at the site itself. And that is probably the biggest issue that we find out in the landscape. How do we build healthy soils from urban soil situations, which is often what we're dealing with? And those urban soils most often are highly compacted. There is very little pore space for oxygen and roots to grow in, and the fertility tends to be fairly low. Sometimes you may not have enough organic matter, and we'll talk a little bit about how do we remedy that. But certainly in a site like this, you might also be considered a brownfield where you might have toxic chemicals in the soil as well. So is this really a place where we should plant trees? This is something that we always need to ask ourselves. Are we planting trees in the right places so that we can actually minimize stress in the long term? And what can we do to fix some of those problems in the big scheme of things? So Jim Urban is a landscape architect who is also now a certified arborist and wrote a book called Up by Roots. He came up with this idea of how much soil volume do you really need to get a good healthy tree? And certainly it depends on what species it is, but a minimum in some communities now, they're requiring at least 600 cubic feet of soil volume in order to actually get the amount of soil that we need to grow a pretty good sized tree. So you can see that's still pretty low if you look at the table, because really we're only going to get trees that might be 10 to 12 inches in diameter in the long term. So we might not get them to grow as big as they actually could grow. This is an example in Oregon. This is in Portland. These are yellowwood trees. And one way that they created a larger space is by creating volume of soil underneath the pavements. And so there's some really cool techniques out there now, civicels, structural soil, things like that, that allow us to plant trees in urban areas, but provide larger soil volumes by putting them underneath a suspended pavement. So it's a really cool idea, but guess what? It is super expensive. So the civicels themselves cost about $25,000 a tree. So most communities can't really afford to do that. Here's a more typical version of what we might see, these big, expansive tree lawns, which how can you not love that? That creates a beautiful sense of place. They're creating a lot of shade and reducing energy costs in that neighborhood. People want to live there. There's lots of data out there about how trees can really improve the community and real estate values and so forth. So giving them a lot of space. And so these are pretty wide tree lawns. So you have trees that can potentially reach their genetic size. One of the things oops, I zipped through that one. One of the things we sometimes forget to talk about too is in these compacted urban areas, we often want to do development. Well, how do we protect the soil that is there on the site? Now, temporarily, there are methodologies to keep soil in site with mulch and other activities like that. But in the long run, one of the biggest issues that we have, particularly here in the South, are our gully washer rainstorm events. And a lot of that has to do with landscapes that are not fully covered with vegetation. And so planting trees and shrubs and other ground covers are incredibly important and one of the most key functional uses for plant material in our urban areas. So it really means, again, how do we prep soil? How do we keep soil on the site? And compacted soil is certainly not the answer. So you can see here one of the examples. A lot of people ask me questions, of course, about growing grass under trees, turf grass, and I tell them it is not a winning battle by any means. Most of the time, the grass will not win, the tree will not really win. So you will have too much shade for most of our grass species here in the South, particularly our warm season grasses. I love this picture of the guy standing there in a tree hole, planting a tree. Why do we dig really big holes? They tell everybody to dig a hole that's 2 to 3 times the root ball size, right? But then we go in and we compact the heck out of the soil once we've planted it. Now this is extreme, but I have actually seen people use mechanical tampers to get soil back into the hole. And I will talk about that a little bit more in a second. So what about adding organic matter? There's a lot of talk out there about this now, and I'm hearing a lot, and I'm doing a little bit of a research project on this idea of a designer soil. These designer soils are expensive. They have about 30% by volume organic matter added typically, and they are screened. And I'm finding that screening is probably one of the biggest challenges for our soils. And here's why. You think about having a very heterogeneous soil out in any landscape, a natural landscape. There's rocks, there's wood, there's organic matter, there's soil, there's all kinds of stuff in there. When we screen it, we take everything apart and we break it down to its smallest components. So we've lost a lot of that aggregation. And so what you end up is with this soil that's almost all the same texture, and it all kind of tightens together, and you end up with something akin to cement. And so that is a really big concern. And so we need to try to get these folks that are writing the specifications for our landscape plantings to stop requiring the screening of soil. I understand it may be easier to work with, but in the long run, it is not what is best for plants. So when we talk about how much organic matter should we add, there's a lot of information out there. And I'll tell you, the majority of the research over the past 20, 30 years has indicated that adding any kind of organic matter like pine bark, yard waste, compost, to just the backfill of a hole, if you're planting a single tree, does not really help with the establishment of that plant or its growth. Now, that said, if your client wants you to add it, go ahead. It's not going to hurt anything, but make sure you charge them for it. But it doesn't even work in compacted soil situations. And these are some folks that have been around doing research for a very long time. Ed Gilman is one of probably the most well-known. He's retired from the University of Florida. He has done a lot of work on planting and pruning. So really, even with hard to transplant plants, they're not finding that there's been any really help with adding organic matter. Humic acid, you might hear a lot about now, sea kelp extracts, biostimulants. The work out there says these do not work any better than much of anything else, and they don't necessarily add a big component to that situation. So what about other things? Some studies show that there is a little bit of a functional, some kind of success from adding some organic matter to the soils. But I want you to take note of a lot of these situations. In many of these situations, you'll find that when they add it to a large bed situation, a raised bed, an entire bed, but certainly not just the whole, that's where you're going to get the best impact from adding organic matter. So as I said, it ranges from 5 to 30%. Remember, a native soil, most native soils only have about 5% organic matter. So it really depends somewhat on what you're trying to grow, how well it's doing, how well the plants are going to adjust to that site. But organic matter has been shown by a lot of research to kind of encourage the growth of beneficial organisms, which can help fight those organisms like fungi, like Phytophthora, that may not be beneficial to plant growth. So it also improves the chemical nature of the soil as well as the structural nature of the soil. So you get a lot better nutrient cycling, particularly nitrogen. You add a lot of cation exchange sites, which helps reduce leaching of those, especially if you're adding fertility. That's really an important component there. And it can hold some pesticides in that soil situation as well. We talked about improving physical properties, remember, because a compacted soil has very poor physical properties. The pores are very tight. It's a very heavy soil oftentimes. But keep in mind, too, a lot of people think that clay soil is the worst soil out there for compaction. Turns out it's actually not necessarily. So sandy soils can have a much higher bulk density even than some clay soils. It's just in how all the particles fit together. So a really well-tilled soil, a soil that has a lot of aggregation, and rocks and other materials in there can actually be really the best for fighting insects and disease problems in the future in those landscapes. Some of you may or may not have heard of biochar. Bartlett Tree Care Company has been doing a lot of work with biochar in the past few years. They had at one point been recommending it in almost every landscape. I think they have stepped back from that a little bit now. They have found, though, that it does improve physical properties because it also does add a lot of cation exchange capacity, so it holds more nutrients and water. It does hopefully somewhat prevent increased disease resistance. So especially because it proliferates these rhizobacteria and fungi that are really helpful to plant growth and often are kind of antagonistic to Phytophthora and other kind of bad actor root rot issues. So increased beneficial organisms, obviously that's a really important part of it. Improves resistance to biotic stresses and stuff like that too. So Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm at my mom's house in Pittsburgh. I had to come here, and so you might have heard the phone doing crazy things. Anyway, I apologize for that. So the one really important part of this whole equation is adding good organic matter to the soil. It has to be high quality. You have to be getting it from a reputable source. That's really the most important part of when you're buying those materials. Now, this may seem pretty straightforward, right? Picking the right plant for a site. But that is not often what we do. We're often guided by whatever a landscape architect might prefer in a site or a designer might prefer in a site. And I'm certainly not speaking poorly of landscape architects, but oftentimes they are not trained in plants. They're not trained in horticulture. So they don't always know the best plants for a site. I often look at designs here when I'm in North Carolina that have been designed by a landscape architect in the northern part of the country. And so they're going to pick trees that might do well in their part of the world, but may not do well in the south. So that happens quite frequently, actually. And so we really need to be cautious. And if you're a landscaper, working with your designer or your landscape architect or even an engineer on a project can really be an important way to get everybody on the same page and make sure that we are making the best choices for those landscapes. So the plants really need to meet, you need to meet the cultural requirement of the plant, but you need to meet what else is also happening on that site. Obviously, we're planting plants in urban areas for humans, right? So we want them to be stress tolerant. We want them to live a pretty long period of time. So there are kind of 4 characteristics that we usually think about. The functionality is one that we haven't always thought about as much as we should have in the past. Everybody wants something to look pretty. So that's really important, and I'm not going to diminish that notion of an aesthetically appealing landscape. That's super important. But what we're really going to get the biggest bang for our buck is on the functionality. How are we putting plants in the landscape? Most of the benefits from plants, if you went online, there's a little thing called the tree benefits calculator, and you just can Google that and find it. And you put in the species of tree, the size of your tree, and your zip code. And it will spit back a little pie chart. And on that pie chart, it'll tell you, well, how much is each portion of the economy going to benefit from planting this tree? What you'll find is that managing for stormwater runoff is one of the most economical reasons to plant woody plants, particularly trees, in the landscape. So it's a really cool little tool. It just gives you some ideas. I tell you how much this tree is actually worth per year and how long it would be, how much it'd be worth if it lasted 40 years or so. So really, we're trying to get plants, and we have to think about what our climate is going to be like in the next 5 to 10 to 15, 20 years. We are going to be experiencing much more heat. We're going to be experiencing more extremes, as we're already seeing now, where we have 2 weeks of 80-degree weather, and then it becomes winter again. So those are really challenging events for plants to adapt to. So we have to make sure we're creating the most beneficial environment for them to grow in to start with, so that they can be more resistant, or resilient is a word you might hear a lot of right now. So again, the urban heat island is something certainly that we have to deal with if we're working in very urbanized areas. So pretty straightforward. So functionality, why are we planting this? What is it that you want that plant to do for you? Are these trees planted in the correct site? Those are pretty large maturing trees for that picture on the bottom. Pretty small tree lawn area, pretty large maturing trees to be that close to the building. Doesn't mean we don't want trees there, but maybe that's not the right species to select for that site. So have we already set ourselves up to have to do some major pruning and major maintenance on those, which means we might not be thinking economically, because all of those things cost money. So being sustainable also means that we're thinking economically as well about what's happening in the site. Should these trees have been planted in these locations? Certainly not. The one under the utility line that's mostly dead, that was just not a good site for a tree, no matter how you twist it. I love trees, but this was not certainly a place to plant a tree. And so you can see that that was a Zelkova, and it's actually failing. A Zelkova will get up into the utility line, so not the best tree for that site. This was a big tree. Obviously, this is a big oak where they cut the interior out. They did proper pruning here, but it still doesn't make the tree look very attractive. The sad thing is, I don't know if you can see, is kind of, and maybe to the left of the tree as I'm looking at it, is a very small little seedling that they put in, actually a 2-inch caliper tree probably that they put in right adjacent to this, which is great planning for the future if that other large tree dies, but it's also a large maturing tree put under the utility line. So kind of Two mistakes all in one. This is in downtown, the picture of these magnolias is in downtown Washington, D.C., where you have big spaces like that. Take use of that and put plant material in those spaces. And they've got the soil covered, so it keeps the roots cool. Just a really nice little spot there. The other picture is in Raleigh, kind of near NC State's campus. These are large willow oak and certainly a very narrow tree lawn. It worked this time, but oftentimes you will have an infrastructure issue with sidewalks pushing up, and it is most often the case that the homeowner will have to pay to have those sidewalks fixed. The city, even though they may be their trees, does not usually pay for that. So that's a really big issue, and we have to be thinking about, should a large maturing tree be placed in those sites? I love the picture at the top is actually in Kitty Hawk. Those are Hollywood junipers. Now, they're not going to provide a lot of shade for that, but they are pretty cool. Kind of a Horton Here's a Who planting if you're familiar with Dr. Seuss. I love them. They're super neat looking. They're probably going to survive very, very well there. Are they going to provide shade? No, not so much, but they're kind of a cool, just crazy idea. So, and they're working in this case. The other pictures are, one is in Portland, Oregon. That is a stormwater BMP. Remember that those things need to be maintained or else they will silt in and you will have issues where they do not function as they should anymore. So plant material and BMPs, a great way to filter nitrogen from the water system. The other one is downtown DC again, and those are Zelkova. We planted Zelkova, think back, as a replacement for our American elm because they have the same kind of habit. I'm finding now, though, that Zelkova tend to have a lot of issues interior to the canopy. They end up with cankers, and they end up dying fairly slowly. So I don't often recommend those anymore. This is a picture taken in Europe. They do a lot of pruning to their trees. They manage them very, very tightly. And so it's just a very different way of looking at things. Those are planted right in the street, and they do that a lot in many European cities. And it doesn't seem to affect the trees that much at all. It seems to work quite well, and people park their cars there and so forth. So really just a cool idea of urban parks and thinking about how do we get the most out of our planting projects. So I don't know if any of you guys know this. Give yourself a kind of quiz what species this is. I'll give you a second. I'll tell you in a minute. But so really thinking about what are the cultural requirements of the plant? What soil type does it need? Meaning what's the textural component of the soil that it prefers? Drainage. Is it okay with wet feet? Does it like it really dry? How about sun? How about hardiness? Provenance is one that we don't talk a whole lot about, but provenance is a hugely important issue when we think about, we grow plants in North Carolina, and they sell a lot of them in the northeastern part of the United States. How well will those plants actually grow up there if they are from a more southern provenance? So it's something that's really complicated. We don't think a whole lot about, but certainly an important issue. How many of you guys guessed ginkgo? That is what that tree is. So ginkgo, very tough, urban tolerant tree, pollution tolerant, but it grows really slowly. And if you're okay with that, and a lot of cities are because it won't take that space over very quickly, that's certainly an option, is picking a slow growing tree. So just a really cool, a really beautiful plant, a great fall color. How well does it handle stress if we're going to plant it in a parking lot area? You know, we talk about red maple and gloomy scale. Red maple is one of those trees that we planted in many, many urban areas. We continue to do so, and it is certainly a tree that is not heat or drought tolerant. It is a bottomland species, so something we should not be planting in parking lots or along streets. Even with irrigation, I find that the tree still really does not thrive in those challenging urban areas. So we have to really be thoughtful in how we pick a plant. How is it going to be maintained? Is it going to be maintained? And therefore, of course, how stress tolerant is to certain issues. This is a pretty common example of urban soil, right? They even had to reclassify it, so they now kind of look at it as a whole new genre. And there's a book called Urban Soil because it's so different than our normal native soils. Usually it might have backfill in it. It has certainly debris in it. You might, in this case, have leftovers from the construction project. So really a tough site for urban trees to grow in. And then you kind of add to that you're putting them in a very small space, maybe not giving them enough rooting volume that the tree will not succeed. And so again, most of the time, 9 times out of 10, what I see in a landscape are plants that are stressed because of an abiotic factor, like improper planting or improper plant selection or weather issues that predispose the plant then to insect and disease problems. How long can a plant live? Certainly in an urban area, they may not live as long as they would in a more natural setting. So it really depends. But I have seen trees, you know, I hear out there thrown around numbers, the average age for an urban tree is 7 years. And I'm going to tell you, I'm not buying into that anymore. I've seen a lot of trees live a much longer period of time than that. And I think, again, we don't give trees as much credit as they deserve, because they are really tough and can handle a lot of really tough situations. But we don't always give them the best potential to really get to their genetic potential. Can they get as old as we want them to? Can they get as big as we would like them to? Because keep in mind, the larger the tree, the more benefits you actually can get from it. And I think I will talk about that in a little bit, just a little bit more detail. So these are 2 really common planted trees. One is October Glory Red Maple. The other, I bet you guys can guess, they're blooming right now in the south. They're almost done. The Calorie Pair, or most commonly planted cultivar, is Bradford. The Calorie Pears are also an invasive species. You find them along many of the roadsides because they were originally planted for the cute little fruit that they produce, and of course the birds love them, and so that's how they spread them everywhere. So it is considered an invasive species, and I don't really recommend planting it anymore, not just for that reason, but because it is not well maintained. If it's not pruned properly, they will split apart and the tree will essentially be pretty much damaged. So you can see why. That's the branch structure of the Calorie Pair, and all of those branches kind of coming out in that general area, all from one spot with really tight, narrow branch unions and bark inclusions, means that something's going to split. It is sensitive to fire blight. If fire blight would just kill them all, the ones that have escaped, that would be great, but it doesn't normally do that. There, of course, is our gloomy scale, and that is a red maple. And I'll just say this red maple was planted. It is in a tough location, and so the tree succumbed. They took it out, but sadly, it was replaced with another red maple. So that was a choice that was incorrect, I believe, and could have been easily avoided, because it will still have the same issues in the future. So we also have to think about what are the client's needs? How do we meet the client's needs? Can we transplant really big trees? I have seen it done quite easily. I've seen it done with an air spade where you blow all the soil off and transplant it. That takes quite a bit of time, but we have to think about what's the site like? Where are we going to put it? How much money do you have? Because planting really large trees can be really expensive. And I see a lot of people speccing trees, not quite this big certainly, but 4-inch caliper trees. My recommendation is always the smaller, the faster they will establish in the site. But a lot of people want that instant landscape, and that's okay. We just have to recognize that if you put in a larger tree at planting, it's going to take that much longer to establish and then essentially be more susceptible to issues during that time. How easy is it for the plant to establish? Will it establish quickly? Some plants do. Other plants not so much. So if you're familiar with Nyssa sylvatica or black gum, that is or tupelo as some people call it, that is a great native species, but it does not transplant well as a ball and burlap tree. You have to use it in a container grown because it for whatever reason, its root system is fairly fibrous and it just doesn't transplant as well. The biggest issue I see in the landscape is people don't water properly. They don't manage plants properly. And my recommendation to a lot of landscape firms is take a soil corer with you so that you can put that down in the root ball area as well as in the planting hole to see if you really need to water the plants. If you don't water. I think we're going to see a lot of issues in the South because we have had so much rain, and a lot of my urban forestry colleagues have been talking about how wet it is and what kind of root rot issues we might see in the next couple of years, and because everything has stayed so wet for so long. So my last kind of point to you about picking the right trees and thinking about this is plant tough trees. but let's just not plant them everywhere. We need to think about what mistakes we've made in the past. Crepe myrtle now with the scale, of course, emerald ash borer and ash trees. So, starting out with Dutch elm disease and American elms. We are reintroducing some American elms that are resistant, and I like to see that. They are really, really tough urban trees. But we have to be really cautious about not overplanting one particular species in any area. There are guidelines out there, but I think some of those just get people a little bit confused, and it's maybe better to just sort of look at it in a more holistic way. The problem is we create these neighborhoods and we put oak trees on Oak Street, and that's all we plant in that neighborhood. And so we really have to be cautious about how many species we use and how much in a particular genus. So there are a lot of oaks out there, and in Raleigh in particular, where I come from, there's a lot of willow oak. And willow oak ends up with issues similar to red maple because it's in a tough urban area and it's hot, and Lucanium scales seem to love those trees. So just something to think about, not overplanting what we find there. So just thinking about the best characteristics of plants is really what plants are capable of adapting to a lot of different environmental conditions out there. Do they need a lot of space? Can they be okay with smaller areas, with that maybe 600 cubic foot of feet that some cities are requiring now at least? How fast do they grow? How adaptable are they? Will they fit whatever function that you want them to fit in that particular site? And just recognizing that no one plant is perfect by any means. Every plant has issues. So dealing with what those issues might be and just recognizing that every tree might have them is really an important part to starting out picking the right plants. So properly planted and placed trees really important to the long-term benefits. It does make them more resistant to insects and disease. And what I had mentioned earlier is trees that are planted correctly, well-maintained, and produce really large canopies are those that are going to be the best at stormwater management, best at reducing energy costs because they'll produce a large shade tree canopy, and certainly going to get more bang for your buck for those. So those are really important issues. It's hard to sell the mayor, though, on carbon sequestration. That doesn't put money in their bank account, so they don't really necessarily understand some of those terms. But they can understand how stormwater can be managed, how if we can mitigate that, we don't have as much pressure on our gray infrastructure in our communities, and that is going to be critically important because a lot of that gray infrastructure is really starting to break down and decline. So really something important, because trees and plants can be the least expensive part of some of this urban green infrastructure when we talk about how do we manage resilient communities. So establishment, when you can sit in a hole like that, you know that you have made the tree hole big enough for whatever you're planting. So really, even keep in mind that if you plant a tree incorrectly, if you're planting a 4-inch caliper tree, it takes a long time to establish, but it can also take a long time to die if it is not planted correctly. University of Georgia, Kim Coder, many years ago came up with the saying, the death spiral. And it's pretty dramatic, but it is pretty true that a tree, once something bad kind of happens to it, or it's not planted correctly, maintained correctly, or in the right spot, it will begin to decline. And so it's that long-term death spiral. So keeping in mind that trees have a lot of stored energy in that wood, especially as they get bigger. And so it takes a long time for a plant to die. So it may go in, and it certainly will most likely live past the warranty period, but if it's not been planted correctly, that will be a huge issue. What I want to point out here on this root ball that you can kind of see is that we noted where the roots are in this root ball because it was planted a little too deep into that root ball at the nursery. So we had to determine where the topmost roots were so that we could determine how deep it should really be planted. And trees should be planted right at grade with those top main order roots right at grade level. So we had to take some of that soil off at the top of that root ball. Sorry, I got sticky fingers this morning. So I love this, the Mulching of America. We see a lot of this. And so I want you guys to be looking at the fill in the blanks here and tell me if you can answer the question on how deep mulch should be. Now, one of the biggest issues I see out there, and the bottom picture kind of shows you this very well. Number one, it's a little too close to the tree. I don't freak out if you have a little bit of bark next to the tree, but this is a little too much, and this is triple shredded hardwood. And what happens with triple shredded, you guys are in the landscape industry, know this, it gets crusted over the top, and it is so thick that it's very difficult for water to actually penetrate into that mulch. So fluffing it up and making sure you never have more than 3 inches or so of hardwood bark mulch on top. Pine straw, you can get up to 4 to 6 inches. It's kind of fluffy, so it's not as big a deal. On herbaceous flower beds, you should be at no more than 1 to 2 inches max. And really important on herbaceous plants to keep the mulch away from the crowns of the plant, or you will end up holding water in that basal rosette and end up with root rot issues. So just really important to keep in mind that if you plant your root ball a little above grade and then you mulch it, if you're using that triple shredded, water's going to flow off the top of that root ball and not really penetrate well into those root systems. And that's really a challenge for keeping water in that. And mulch is great. Mulch is certainly a really important part of weed control, as well as mitigating temperatures and holding moisture in the root ball. That top picture, that tree is only actually about 10 feet tall. So that's about a third of what we call the volcano mulching. So that's just crazy. I don't know whoever started that, but it still happens out there, and it's kind of dismaying. So again, mulching is really important in mitigating temperatures and minimizing water loss, and especially in the South in our really dry summers when we have them can be really important. And it can help benefit soil microorganisms and such. What I want to show you in this little sketch is notice where the mulch starts. And this is kind of a newer recommendation. By the way, I don't recommend staking like that. And if you ever want to talk about staking, we can do that at some other point. But that's not holding what needs to be held down. The root ball needs to be held down. And so there are means of staking just the root ball itself. But I want you to notice that the mulch actually starts at the edge of the root ball and goes out away from it. So they don't recommend putting mulch right on top of the root ball anymore. Now, it's not a big deal if you do, but the reason for that is that you're going to get better infiltration of water and oxygen movement in and out of that root ball rather than holding too much water in that position. So just a different way of looking at it. That's come out of Ed Gilman's lab at the University of Florida as well. So this is a pretty good example of what you can do with mulch. It's kind of, you can see it's away from the trunk. It's on the edge of that root ball. You can do the kind of the berm if you want. That's not necessarily required. It does kind of help hold the water in where you want it in the root ball and in the soil in the hole. So really important to add mulch correctly. Remember, mulch is not organic matter though. You can use compost. You can use wood chips with leaf compost mixed in, which is a mix we make at our field lab and they use on campus. So you have something that breaks down quickly and something that takes a little longer to break down. And so that's one way to incorporate organic matter into the soil in a slower fashion. But bark is very different than organic matter per se. So we talk a lot about fertilization, and I get a lot of questions on fertilization. And there are ANSI standards out there. The ISA has little booklets on how to fertilize, and a lot of this that I'll be talking about comes from their information. But so one of the things that we first want to really ask ourselves is, why are we fertilizing? We do a lot of fertility, particularly on turf grass. And some studies out of the University of Wisconsin, a guy named Dr. Bob Miller had done studies previously. He's retired now. He lives in New Bern and he's got a boat. So we don't see him too often anymore talking about trees. But his laboratory really started asking these questions because he was doing some nitrogen research. And they targeted, where does the nitrogen end up? And you might not be surprised to find out that most of it actually ends up in the water table. So we have to be really cautious about, how are we applying it? How will the tree respond, or how will the woody plant respond, or how will the turf respond to fertilization? Will it harm the plant? Will it make it live longer? What are the benefits, short-term and long-term? Will the fertilizer stay where we put it? And if it doesn't stay where we put it, where will it go? And can it cause an impact in the environment? And so just a little interesting point here is that Lake Jordan outside of Raleigh has got a lot of nitrogen nutrient issues, and they're saying that it's come from the city of Durham. So it's been a huge issue. They've tried to do some very expensive ways of cleaning that lake, and I can see in the future the potential that if you are to apply fertilizers, you may have to have an applicator's license, much like you do with pesticides. I know some states are looking at that, or some that have potentially already done so. So it can be a really pretty important issue, because we have to make sure we're applying fertilizers when the plants are going to use them. And that's one of the biggest factors to consider. So it's like kind of writing a prescription. You know, you go to the doctor and you tell them what's going on, and they get your history and they know what's happening in your body, and they say, okay, we're going to write you this prescription and this should make you better if you take it correctly, right? So writing a fertilizer prescription can be a really important thing too. And of course, the most important step is actually doing a soil test so that you know what's going on. If you have plants that are showing nutrient disorders, then you certainly want to take some foliar analysis as well, because we want to make sure, if there are things happening in the soil, if you have plenty of nutrients in the soil, why might it not be getting into the plant? Is the root system not functioning well, or what's going on? Is there insufficient water in the system? So all of those things are kind of questions to ask. What's the nutrient status of the plant? And the only way to do that is a foliar analysis. Now that tends to be a little bit more costly than the soil sample, at least in North Carolina. So how much does the plant need annually? And so they do come up with certain recommendations on that. You know, typically it's 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet for most woody plants. If you don't do a soil test, I have seen recommendations quite a bit higher than that. So again, we want to make sure we're taking into consideration what's happened at the site before, how is the site being managed, what are the soil factors, and what are the plant factors. So if you have a site that already has sufficient nutrient analyses, you may not see any measurable difference in how your plants may grow, especially if they don't have a nutrient issue. So how does fertility affect plant growth? Well, a guy named Dr. Dan Herms out of Ohio State University years ago did some work on this, and he found that fertilization in most landscapes can actually reduce plant resistance to some herbivores, because if you think about it, fertilizers have a lot of nitrogen in it, and it favors growth on the plant, and so you get all this new tasty growth, and a lot of these insects will really do quite well with that nutrient component, and so it can be an issue. And part of the thing to think about too is woody plants have to defend themselves, and so they make certain chemistry that helps them defend themselves against injury, wounding, even pruning, things like that. And so if the plant is directing more of its energy reserves into growth, then it's not using as much of that for defense against insect or disease. So it's a really important balancing act, and just something I wanted to share with you, that there is information out there on really how do we think about fertilizers and what are we doing. So aside from really a nutrient problem, there are many other things that can be happening, and most of the time it is a fairly complex issue. And there are other things going on in the landscape. Is there a physiological problem with the tree? Are there trunk issues? Has there been some girdling? What's happening in the soil? Is there too much light or not enough light? Is there root damage happening, mechanical construction damage or whatever? And those are all really important things to consider in the health of a tree. Have they been using too much pesticides? Is there, and what's the species preference in that site? You know, a lot of people tell me, you know, horticulture ain't rocket science, right? And that is true, but rocket science can be done with really clear-cut formulas. The problem with horticulture is that plants are living things, and so oftentimes it is very complicated and a very complex issue to find out what's going on with our plants in the landscape. And it is usually a suite of issues, meaning there are many factors that often lead to a plant's decline and eventual death. I get many, many calls, and our insect and disease clinic gets many calls, and 9 times out of 10, they cannot find an insect or disease problem on a plant. So it ends up being some sort of abiotic concern, and it's not always easy to narrow down what that might be. So it is really a complex problem, and it isn't really as easy as people think it is. So you guys give yourself credit for really doing a tough job, and growing healthy plants in the landscape is not easy, especially since we're pruning them, putting them in tough places. So pruning is certainly one of my areas of expertise and one of my favorite things to do in the landscape. And so it is really important to do them correctly. One of my biggest soapbox issues is starting when trees are young. No university that I have seen, no city, no one does a very good job of pruning trees when they're young. It just seems we don't put enough energy and enough money into doing that. And the thing is if we did that, we would be making much smaller cuts on trees. The wounds would close over much better. We would have trees that are much more resistant to storm damage, which is incredibly important. And it would save us a boatload of cash in the future, because if we don't have to bring in a climber or a bucket truck or whatever, then we don't have to spend a lot of money trying to fix larger, more mature trees. And if a tree is large and damaged by a storm, it can be challenging to fix them as well. And in some cases, they may not even be repairable. So really something important to think about. And just starting when trees are young, knowing how to do it, making sure you have a single leader on a tree is really important for our shade trees. So knowing what to cut and asking yourself, why am I pruning this particular branch? You'll see in this picture, these are terrible cuts. These are both flush cuts, large cuts as well. And so those wounds will never close over. That is actually a red maple. And if you look close, you can kind of see black specks on it because it also has gloomy scale. So this is a huge issue. We do not recommend wound paint anymore. Nobody, I know they still sell it out there. The tar is particularly terrible. So if you think about it this way, it's kind of a thick black substance. You slap it on a wound and it holds moisture and it's dark in there. And so what likes to be in those kind of sites are many microorganisms. So we don't recommend that anymore. If you learn as much as you can about proper pruning. If you're super interested in pruning, Ed Gilman has 2 books out. Both of them are on structural pruning for trees. They are excellent resources, really great books. They are a little bit pricey. You could try going on Amazon and maybe finding some there, but they are well worth the investment. They are great resources. The last thing I want to say about pruning too is that you really need to match pruning dose to the tree health, because obviously a younger tree can have greater pruning done to it than an older, more mature tree. So a couple other things to think about. These are not flush cuts, but they are still equally as bad cuts. So just we want to make sure that we have people that know what they're doing when they are pruning in our landscapes. Avoid pruning when there's drought. We don't want to prune a plant. And I tell a lot of people, especially with these really erratic climate things we have kind of going on now, is a lot of people will ask me, well, how do I know if my plant's dead? And that may seem straightforward, but not always. I always tell people to give the plant the benefit of the doubt. If you can leave it until the growing season, see what happens. And then if you have to pull it out, then you certainly can do so. Or if you need to do some pruning because you know now what's dead and what might not be dead, that's really the best way, is give the plant a little bit of time to shake things out and see what happens come spring. Especially if you've had a tough winter, or if last summer it was really wet or last summer was really dry. Let's see how the plants are responding. So again, just don't remove a whole lot of material from mature trees. Usually they say no more than 10% of the canopy on a mature tree. And I would say that it all really depends on the health of the plant, how big the wounds are that you might be making. And we want to minimize the amount of large branches we take off of plants because they really probably will not close those wounds over. The wound is too large and the tree is kind of too old. So those are kind of things to think about. So kind of a few final thoughts for y'all to think about as you head off into your day is, the most important thing to me, and my PhD was on soils. Healthy soils are really the basis for a healthy, sustainable landscape. If we aren't creating good soil situations or providing plants with enough soil volume, a plant will not thrive. Now, it could live for a really long time and be okay, but I think we're oftentimes selling our plants short. We're like, okay, it's alive, that's all we need, but it would be much better if we had plants that actually thrived in the landscape, because they're going to be worth more in the big scheme of things, economically, aesthetically, socially, functionally, as I mentioned before. making sure that we pick the right plants, and that's going to become much more challenging. So we have to be really thoughtful about that. I've been telling folks to think about, and a lot of forestry folks are doing research to look at how their forests are changing because of climate change, communities becoming much warmer. How are species composition changing? So in our case in Raleigh, we're a zone 7-ish. Could we try some zone 8 plants? I think that would be not a bad idea, just in a thoughtful, maybe measured way, not a whole ton of one species being planted everywhere. Properly maintaining and planting trees, I can't stress enough, that is really critically important to do that well, to think about it, to make sure we're writing good specifications. And actually, if you go to Ed Gilman's website at the University of Florida, he has specifications for different planting techniques, different staking techniques, and they're all free to use. They're CAD compatible, so they can be shared with landscape architects as well. They're based on his research, and that to me is really important, that we're doing stuff based on sound research practices. Writing really good fertilizer prescriptions that really match the site, that we're not overdoing it, that we're applying them when the plants are actually going to be using them, so we can minimize any kind of off-site environmental issue. So we're trying to keep plants healthy, we're trying to maximize their growth, we're trying to keep them resistant to insects and diseases. So we really want to think about, kind of in some cases, erring on the side of caution. So I want to thank you for your time today. There's my email address if you ever want to contact me and ask questions. There are a couple of some cool YouTube videos there on planting and fertility that I've done recently. So certainly you can Google me at NC State and can get hooked up to some of those resources. Thanks very much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Barbara. This was wonderful information, very entertaining, and gave us a lot to think about. I like to think of these landscapes as complex entities, and with all the variety of species that we grow, it still amazes me that we could really look at trees in the urban areas as very much monoculture, and that can create quite a few issues. Couple of other thoughts I've had are we have these more extremes in the climates that seem to be creating a lot of what I consider chronic stress.
Yep.
And if things don't die within a couple of years, they may actually be subjected to the stress over time, and that puts strain on them, just like we are. I mean, they're
right. Right.
So,
yeah.
And like you said, I mean, we're going to see more and more of these fluctuations, and we tend to not recognize what's not in front of us.
Right.
So the other thought I had was when you take a walk in the woods, trees and plants, shrubs, they don't look perfect. They have blemishes, but yet in our landscapes, we want everything to be perfect.
Right.
So that's maybe we should just not look so much at the details and just acknowledge the beauty in nature in the spots and blemishes and holes and things.
That's very true, right? That's how we pick fruit and vegetables in the store, right? We want everything to be perfect. So sometimes that means a little bit different way of looking at things, for sure.
All right, we have a question. Bob. Hi, Bob.
Hey, Bob.
When is the best time of year to fertilize shrubs and trees? That's the first part of the question. The second is, what are your thoughts about structural soils, such as the Cornell University structural soil? And the last part is, what was the cost of silva cells? Did you say $25,000 per tree? I was like,
right.
Wow.
Okay, so that's the easiest question to answer, and I did say $25,000 a tree. So it does depend on how many cells you put in. There are some folks that are maybe not using quite the number that, and see, this comes out of Deep Root, and actually Jim Urban is the one that created silva cells. There are other competitors in the market now that have similar kind of technology, where the whole goal is to be able to put soil under pavements and suspend the pavement over top so that you can drive a fire truck over top of them without compacting the soil. That's the whole gist of silva cells. So if you think about I always look at them sort of almost like milk crates, right? Stacked on top of each other, but with space for roots and soil to grow into. So you can reduce the cost somewhat by not putting as many in as deep or as wide, and still get some impact, but certainly that is the average cost per tree. So the other part of the question was the structural soils. And I have seen great success with structural soils. There was a planting done in downtown Raleigh on Fayetteville Street, and I believe they were overcup oak that they put in, and they used structural soils there. Structural soils are about half the cost of Civicels. So it is still not inexpensive by any means. It still is quite costly. But these trees were put in at, I believe, a 4-inch caliper size, and 7 years later, the trees are close to 10-inch diameter. So they are doing amazingly well in this site. Again, I think it depends on a lot of it depends on the success of the material that's being used. If you can source the stone and organic matter locally, that is really important as well, because it's going to match potentially the pH of the soils in that native region. Stay-lite or Permatil is a product that is sold extensively in the South. That is something they've been using instead of gravel in some of our sites down here, and seems to be very successful as well. So I want to say cautiously, it seems to work all right. But I always am hesitant because there's not a ton of research done on any of these things, because it takes so long to do tree research. That's why I did herbaceous perennial work to get tenure, and then now I'm looking at trees. So anyway, so yeah, tree research is hard to do it because it takes time, and but there's a lot of good stuff out there. If you can access the Journal of Arboriculture and Urban Forestry online. Even if you're not necessarily a member, you can look at the archived editions of the journal and find all kinds of information on all of the things I talked about today. The other question I know was when to fertilize trees and shrubs. So that's a little bit more of a tricky question, because some research says spring, some research says fall. In general, what the ISA recommends is you can do it during the growing season. So the root system needs to be growing. So if you can do it, like, you could probably fertilize now, because the roots of trees in the South are already starting to grow, because they're coming out of dormancy. So that's really important. My general recommendation is, say they tell you you need 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. I usually recommend putting half of it on in the spring and half of it on in the fall. So and again, just timing it to make sure we're not putting it on too late in the fall, because it won't really do much at that point. Plus, it's not necessary. You know, a lot of people worry it'll spur a lot of new growth. Not if you do it late enough in the fall, like we're talking October or whatever. You're not going to tell the plant to do something it's not physiologically activated for doing at that time of the year, if that makes sense. So I hope I got all those questions.
All right. Bob just said thank you. He was one of our speakers in the previous January webinar. So he talked a lot about pruning, and just like you, he's very passionate about pruning. We all are, because
yeah,
it's so often done not right.
That is correct, sadly.
Yes. And one other thing I wanted to mention is I really think that Dr. Gilman put forth a great effort in all his years working at the University of Florida. And that website you mentioned, I had used it many times myself.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Those of you who don't know that website, you should. It's great, and you can get lost and spend days, months, years enjoying that information. It's very pictorially rich. It's very easy to read and understand these concepts, even though they're scientifically sound and research rich. But yeah, please do so. I really highly recommend it.
And all you have to do is Google Ed Gilman, Gilman, and it'll lead you to that website at the University of Florida. He is retired, but he still does a lot of training down there for them. And I've seen him. We've had him speak in North Carolina for our Urban Forestry Council. He is amazing, and he has a lot of great recommendations. Some of it is really awesome, but not always necessarily applicable. You know, we talk about, when we tell people about pruning, right, we say, take off 20% of the canopy. And what does that actually mean? To some people, your 20% may be different than my 20%. So he's kind of come up with a new idea of writing specifications for pruning that says, take off this many 2-inch diameter branches. And that is a much more challenging concept to get across to tree care firms, because we're all about, you know, production, which is what we kind of have to be to make a living. So trying to get some of this really great information into practice has been the biggest challenge. And so I spent a lot of time talking about pruning and planting techniques. And he has on his website the staking I was telling you about, which is actually holding the root ball down, not the top of the tree, just the root ball is what we need to hold down. And we don't always need to stake, and we do overstake. And then that leads to other problems. So great, like as Bodhi said, a great website to check out.
I actually had an opportunity to see his staking in action in Salt Lake City.
Yeah, cool.
I was like, wait a minute, I think I recognize where that came from.
Neat. Yeah, that's what I teach all the time now. And the landscapers find it intriguing. It is quite easy to do in most cases. And inexpensive.
Yeah, why didn't we think about it before, right?
I don't know.
All right. Well, we're at the end of our webinar. And again, thank you again, Dr. Fair.
You're welcome.
We appreciated both of you waking up so early and getting up with us. We learned a lot. And you want me to say something about the credits?
Yeah. Again, thank you, Dr. Fair, Dr. Cole.
The ISA has awarded us for the second talk, BSMA Science,
a quarter credit.
Practice, half a credit, management, quarter credit, climber specialist, certified arborist, utility specialist, municipal specialist, and aerial lift. Each of those gets 1 credit. So somewhat different than the first hour, but the climber specialist to the aerial lift each get 1 credit for each of the talks. So, all right, anything else?
No, that's it. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, our speakers. Great job.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. And Bob, thanks for tuning in with us again. Good to see you again. Thanks, Bob. It was good to see you the other day.